You're about to hear one of the most successful betrayals in modern history. For more than 30 years, a Soviet spy sat inside British intelligence, helping run the very department tasked with hunting Soviet spies. He wasn't some shadowy outsider. He had the right accent, the right schools, the right friends. Everyone trusted him. And when the one man who could expose him tried to defect, the message landed directly on his own desk. Within days, that man vanished. What happened next didn't just save a spy, it exposed a weakness in the entire Western intelligence system, and it all began with a coded message in Istanbul. Istanbul, August 1945. A coded message arrives at the British consulate. The sender is Konstantin Volkov, a senior officer in the Soviet NKVD, the predecessor to the KGB. He wants out. He wants to defect, and he's willing to pay for his freedom with the most valuable currency in the intelligence world: names. Volkov claims he can identify 3 Soviet moles buried deep inside the British government. 2 of them, he says, are operating within the Foreign Office. But it's the 3rd name that would detonate like a bomb in the heart of British intelligence. The 3rd mole, Volkov insists, is currently serving as the head of a counter-espionage section within MI6 itself. Think about that for a moment. A Soviet intelligence officer is offering to expose the most damaging penetration in British history, the kind of information that wins wars, the kind of information that gets people killed. The message is encrypted, flagged urgent, and sent to London for immediate action. It lands on a desk in Broadway Buildings, the headquarters of MI6. The man reading it is Kim Philby. Charming, Cambridge-educated, impeccably connected, rising star of British intelligence. He is, at that very moment, serving as head of Section 9, the anti-Soviet division of MI6. He is also the 3rd mole. Philby is reading his own death warrant. If Volkov talks, everything collapses. 30 years of careful deception. The ideology he pledged himself to in his 20s. The Soviet cause he has served faithfully since 1934. All of it exposed. Prison, disgrace, possibly the hangman's rope. But Philby doesn't panic. He never panics. That's what makes him so dangerous. Instead, he plays for time. The most delicate operation of his entire career begins not with dead drops or coded transmissions, but with bureaucratic delay. He tells his superiors he needs time to ponder the memo. Overnight, he says, just to consider the implications. What he actually needs is time to contact his Soviet handler, a man known by the codename Bob. The message is simple. Volkov must be silenced. Moscow moves fast when it needs to. Philby then volunteers himself to fly to Istanbul and personally handle the defection. His superiors agree. After all, who better than their top anti-Soviet man? It's a masterful piece of misdirection. The fox has just been asked to guard the henhouse. But Philby doesn't rush. He delays his departure for days. He claims scheduling difficulties, travel complications, the usual excuses. Each hour that passes is another hour for Soviet intelligence to locate Volkov and close the trap. By the time Philby's plane finally touches down in Istanbul, it's already over. Volkov has vanished. Witnesses at the airport would later report something disturbing. 2 figures, heavily bandaged, unable to walk on their own, were carried onto a Soviet transport plane. The plane's destination was Moscow. Those 2 figures were Konstantin Volkov and his wife. They were never seen again. The bandages weren't medical. They were restraints. Volkov had been beaten, drugged, and prepared for the long flight back to the Lubyanka, the KGB's notorious prison. What happened next followed a grimly predictable script: interrogation, torture, a confession extracted under conditions no human being should endure. Then a bullet to the back of the head. Philby knew all of this when he landed in Istanbul. He knew it as he filed his report claiming the defection had mysteriously fallen through. He knew it as he returned to London, his cover intact, his career undamaged, his Soviet masters deeply grateful. He had just murdered a man without ever touching him. And here's what makes this moment so chilling. No one suspected a thing. Philby's colleagues saw only a dedicated officer who had flown halfway across Europe to handle a sensitive operation. His superiors praised his diligence. The fact that the operation had failed was attributed to bad luck, Soviet counterintelligence, the fog of the early Cold War. The idea that their own man had sabotaged the defection from the inside. Unthinkable. Philby was one of them. Cambridge, good family, the right accent, the right clubs. In the class-bound world of 1940s, British intelligence, populated by part-time stockbrokers and agreeable Epicureans from the bars of Whites and Boodles, such a man simply could not be a traitor. That assumption would protect him for another 18 years. Philby had just sent the one man who could expose him to certain death. But this was no lone wolf. He was part of a conspiracy forged years earlier, not in the shadowy alleys of Moscow, but in the privileged, hallowed halls of Cambridge University. From the cold-blooded act of a master spy, we go back to the moment the ideology was forged, to understand the why behind the betrayal. Cambridge University, 1933. Picture the ancient stone courtyards, the oak-panelled libraries, the gentlemen's clubs where the sons of the British Empire gathered to drink sherry and debate philosophy. This was the training ground for future prime ministers, diplomats, and spy masters, the very heart of the establishment. But outside those ivy-covered walls, the world was burning. The Great Depression had shattered faith in capitalism. Unemployment lines stretched through every major city in Britain and America. Banks collapsed. Fortunes vanished. The system that had promised prosperity had delivered only misery. And into that vacuum of despair, two competing ideologies were rising to fill the void. In Germany, Adolf Hitler had just seized power. In Italy, Mussolini's fascists were already entrenched. Across Europe, the far right was on the march, and Western democracies seemed paralyzed, unable or unwilling to stop them. And then there was the Soviet Union. To young intellectuals at Cambridge, Moscow offered something intoxicating. A vision of a planned society, scientific government, equality, progress. The Soviets claimed they had solved the contradictions of capitalism. They had a plan. They had purpose. And most importantly, they appeared to be the only force on earth willing to stand against Hitler. This was the ideological furnace in which four brilliant young men would be forged into traitors. Kim Philby, the son of a legendary Arabist and explorer, charming, ambitious, with a stutter that somehow made him more endearing. Guy Burgess, flamboyant, alcoholic, promiscuous, and possessed of one of the sharpest minds of his generation. Donald Maclean, tall, handsome, the son of a former cabinet minister, destined for the highest reaches of the Foreign Office. And Anthony Blunt, an art historian of extraordinary refinement, already moving in circles that would eventually lead him to Buckingham Palace itself. They were not outsiders. They were the ultimate insiders. Products of the finest schools, connected to the highest families, groomed from birth to rule. And every single one of them looked at the system that had created them and concluded it was rotten to the core. For these men, joining the communist cause was not treason. It was a higher loyalty, a moral imperative. When Philby travelled to Vienna in 1934 and witnessed fascist forces crushing a socialist uprising, when he helped smuggle refugees to safety and married a young communist activist named Litzy Friedman, he wasn't betraying his country. In his mind, he was trying to save it from itself. Soviet intelligence recognized the opportunity immediately. The NKVD, Moscow's Foreign Intelligence Service, understood something profound about the British establishment. It was built entirely on trust, the old-school tie, the right accent, the proper family connections. If you had these things, doors opened automatically. Questions were never asked, suspicions were never raised, and here were 4 young men who had all of these things. 4 men who were already believers. True ideological converts who would never need to be paid, threatened, or coerced. They would spy for the Soviet Union not for money, but for love, for faith. A Soviet recruiter approached Philby in London in June of 1934. The instructions were simple. Abandon all visible connections to communism. Stop attending meetings. Stop signing petitions. Cut ties with left-wing friends. Become, to all outward appearances, a conventional member of the British upper class. And then wait. The Soviets were playing a long game. They weren't interested in immediate intelligence. They wanted something far more valuable. They wanted to plant seeds that would take years, even decades, to bear fruit. They wanted these 4 young men to climb the ladders of British power, to embed themselves so deeply in the establishment that no one would ever think to question their loyalty. One by one, the others were recruited. Burgess, Maclean, Blunt. Each received the same instructions. Bury your beliefs. Build your careers. Report everything. The Cambridge ring was operational. Guy Burgess would eventually penetrate MI6. Donald Maclean would rise to the highest levels of the Foreign Office, gaining access to the most sensitive diplomatic communications between Britain and America. Anthony Blunt would join MI5 itself, the very organization tasked with catching Soviet spies. And Kim Philby would do something even more audacious. He would join the British Intelligence Service's counter-espionage section, becoming the man responsible for hunting Soviet agents. The Fox had been hired to guard the henhouse. They were no longer just student radicals. They were assets of a foreign power. Their mission was not to tear down the British establishment, but to become it. And for the next 2 decades, their success would be terrifyingly absolute. Now that we know why they did it, we witness the devastating effectiveness of their infiltration and the first mistake that threatened to bring it all crashing down. By 1941, the Cambridge Five had achieved something Moscow could scarcely believe: total penetration. Not of a single agency, not of a single ministry, but of the entire British intelligence apparatus, simultaneously. Kim Philby rose through MI6 like a man destined for greatness. Because in every way that mattered, he was. His colleagues described him as the only serious professional in a service populated by part-time stockbrokers and retired Indian policemen. He was competent. He was dedicated. He was, in the words of one of Britain's sharpest wartime intelligence minds, destined to head the service. The very qualities that made him the perfect spy were indistinguishable from the qualities that made him the perfect traitor. Donald Maclean climbed the ranks of the Foreign Office until he sat at the nexus of the most sensitive secrets in the Western Alliance. Atomic research, post-war planning, direct communications between Churchill and Roosevelt. Every cable, every memorandum, every strategic decision passed across his desk. And then it passed to Moscow. Guy Burgess embedded himself at the BBC, then the Foreign Office. His legendary alcoholism and outrageous behaviour somehow never disqualifying him from positions of trust. The British establishment found him amusing, eccentric, one of their own. Anthony Blunt operated inside MI5 itself. The agency tasked with catching Soviet spies had a Soviet spy running its counterintelligence operations. And John Cairncross worked at Bletchley Park, the crown jewel of British intelligence, the place where they broke the Enigma code. Stalin knew what Hitler was planning before Hitler's own generals did. The damage was catastrophic. A CIA assessment later concluded that the entire Western intelligence effort from 1944 to 1951 operated at what they called minus advantage. That's intelligence terminology for a brutal truth. The West would have achieved better outcomes by doing nothing at all. Every operation Philby touched, he inverted. Every agent the West deployed, Moscow knew about. Allied operatives were sent into Eastern Europe. They were captured, they were tortured, they were killed. Not because of bad luck, because Kim Philby had handed their names to his Soviet handler. And the most dangerous moment? It came not from any investigation, but from a man named Konstantin Volkov. August 1945, Istanbul. A coded message arrives at the British consulate. Volkov, a senior NKVD officer, wants to defect. His price is simple: safe passage and cash. His prize is priceless. The real names of 3 Soviet moles inside the British government, 2 in the Foreign Office, and 1, he says, leading a counter-espionage section within MI6 itself. The message is sent to London, and it lands on the desk of the very man Volkov is about to expose. Kim Philby reads the cable. He understands immediately. This is extinction-level exposure, so he plays for time. He tells his superiors he needs to ponder the memo overnight. That night, he makes an emergency contact with his Soviet handler, a man codenamed Max. The message back is calm, almost gentlemanly. "Don't worry, old man. We've seen a lot worse." Philby delays his flight to Istanbul for days. Travel complications, he says. Bureaucratic delays. By the time his plane finally touches down, it's too late. Volkov has vanished. Witnesses later reported seeing 2 heavily bandaged figures, presumed to be Volkov and his wife, being carried onto a Soviet plane bound for Moscow. They were never seen again. Philby had not only saved himself, he had sent a man to his certain death. And he had done it using official British channels, sabotaging the investigation into himself from the inside. For 6 more years, the network continued to operate. But by 1951, the walls were closing in. American codebreakers working on a project called Venona had been decrypting old Soviet communications, and they had identified a spy, codenamed Homer, inside the British Embassy in Washington. The trail led directly to Donald Maclean. A warrant for his interrogation was days away. But a warning had already been sent. From Washington. From Kim Philby. The task of extracting the panicked Maclean fell to the most unreliable man imaginable. Guy Burgess. Friday, May 25th, 1951. After a farewell dinner, the 2 men begin a frantic nighttime drive to the port of Southampton. They abandon Maclean's car at the dock. They board the midnight ferry to Saint-Malo, and they disappear into the darkness of the English Channel. When investigators arrive at Maclean's home the next morning, his wife claims he's simply gone for the weekend. But upstairs, they find a half-packed suitcase. At the Southampton dock, they find Burgess's abandoned car. The 2 diplomats had vanished, leaving behind a trail of confusion that would soon explode into the biggest spy scandal in British history. Here's the problem. Guy Burgess was never supposed to defect. He was supposed to escort Maclean to safety and return. But Burgess, drunk and panicking, made a catastrophic decision. He kept running. And that changed everything. Because Guy Burgess had been living in Kim Philby's house in Washington. They were known associates, close friends. The connection was impossible to ignore. With 2 of their members now behind the Iron Curtain, a frantic mole hunt began. The press called it the case of the missing diplomats. But inside MI5, the question was simpler. Who was the 3rd man who tipped them off? All eyes turned to their closest friend, Kim Philby. The public defection created a storm, but the real story was happening behind closed doors, where the establishment made a deal with the devil to avoid embarrassment. After Burgess and McLean vanished, suspicion fell immediately on Kim Philby. He was recalled from Washington. His career, once destined for the very top of MI6, was effectively over. But suspicion is not proof. And the British establishment was about to demonstrate just how far it would go to protect its own. Philby faced intense interrogation, hours of questioning, days of pressure. But he had something his interrogators could never overcome. He was one of them. He spoke their language, he wore their tie, he drank at their clubs, and when he sat across from them in those wood-panelled rooms, he deployed his most devastating weapon: upper-class poise, the quiet confidence of a man who belonged. His slight stammer, which some suspected was an affectation, forced his interrogators to wait, to lean in, to give him time to formulate the perfect response to every accusation. The evidence against him was circumstantial. Damning, yes, but circumstantial. And the establishment simply could not bring itself to believe that one of its finest products, a man groomed at Westminster and Cambridge, a man who had served with distinction in the war, could be a traitor. It was psychologically impossible for them to accept. So they didn't. In 1955, a Member of Parliament publicly named Philby as the third man. The Foreign Secretary was forced to respond. And what did Harold Macmillan say? He declared there was no evidence that Philby had betrayed the interests of this country. Philby even held a press conference. He stood before the cameras, cool and collected, and lied with breathtaking ease. The establishment had cleared one of its own. Case closed. But while Philby was being publicly exonerated, something far more cynical was unfolding in the shadows. Because Philby wasn't the only Cambridge spy still walking free. Anthony Blunt. The name meant nothing to the public in 1964. But within certain circles, it meant everything. Blunt was a distinguished art historian, a former MI5 officer, and most significantly, the surveyor of the Queen's pictures. He walked the halls of Buckingham Palace. He advised Her Majesty on her priceless art collection. He was, in every sense, a pillar of the establishment. He was also a Soviet spy. In April 1964, MI5 finally received undeniable proof. An American, Michael Straight, who had been recruited alongside Blunt at Cambridge, confessed to the FBI and named Blunt as his recruiter. There was no ambiguity, no room for doubt. The evidence was irrefutable. And then came the moment that reveals everything you need to know about how the British establishment truly operated. In a secret meeting, Blunt was confronted with the evidence. Faced with proof he could not deny, he confessed. He admitted to being the fourth man. He laid out his recruitment, his work for the Soviets, his betrayal of everything he had sworn to protect. It should have been the end. A trial. A conviction. A life behind bars. Instead, the British government made a deal. In exchange for a full private confession, Blunt was granted total immunity from prosecution. No trial, no public disgrace, no consequences whatsoever. The reasoning was simple and utterly cynical. A public trial would mean testimony. Testimony would mean revelations. Revelations about how deeply Soviet intelligence had penetrated the British establishment. About how long the cover-up had lasted. About how many officials had looked the other way. And worst of all, it would raise uncomfortable questions about Blunt's proximity to the royal family. The system chose to protect its reputation over exposing the truth. For 15 years, Anthony Blunt lived an astonishing double life. He continued his prestigious career. He continued to advise the Queen. He attended state functions and received honours. He was knighted. And all the while, his treachery remained a closely guarded secret, known only to a handful of people at the very top of the government and the intelligence services. The public remained oblivious. The Queen, allegedly, remained uninformed that a dedicated Soviet spy was walking her corridors, handling her art, trusted with access to her most private spaces. It was a conspiracy of silence, not against a foreign enemy, but against the British people themselves. The secret held until 1979, when Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, reportedly disgusted by the cover-up, stood before Parliament and exposed the traitor in the palace. The nation was stunned, outraged. But by then, Blunt was an old man. He lost his knighthood. He faced public humiliation, but he never spent a single day in prison for crimes that had cost lives and compromised his country for decades. Compare that to George Blake, another Soviet spy caught within MI6. Blake was sentenced to 42 years. Philby, who had done far more damage over far longer, was never prosecuted at all. The system had two standards, one for those who could embarrass the establishment, and one for everyone else. A traitor was given a royal pardon to protect the powerful. But while Blunt was secretly neutralized, allowed to fade into comfortable obscurity, the greatest traitor of them all, the original third man, was in Beirut, working as a journalist, rebuilding his cover, and the net was finally, irrevocably, closing in on him. From the secret deal with Blunt, we now turn to the final, public escape of the ringleader and the ultimate legacy of his actions. January 1963. Beirut. Kim Philby had been living in exile from British intelligence for over a decade, working as a journalist, drinking heavily, waiting. He knew they would come eventually. They always did. The man who came was Nicholas Elliot, his oldest friend, the colleague who had defended him when everyone else had their doubts. Elliot had flown from London with new evidence, irrefutable evidence. A woman named Flora Solomon had finally broken her silence, confirming what the intelligence services had long suspected. Philby had been a Soviet agent since the early 1930s, since before he ever set foot inside MI6. Elliot didn't come to arrest his friend. He came to offer a deal, a full confession in exchange for immunity. No prosecution, no public trial, just a quiet retirement and the chance to unburden his conscience. The two men met in a safe house apartment. Elliot had wired the room. He had watchers on the doors and the streets below. This was not a social call. It was an interrogation dressed in the clothes of friendship. Philby listened, and then, remarkably, he began to talk. After 30 years of lies, the mask finally slipped. He admitted everything: his recruitment in Vienna, his work for Moscow, the agents he had betrayed. He spoke calmly, almost clinically, as if discussing someone else's life. He agreed to return the next day to write and sign a complete confession. But when Elliot arrived the following morning, the apartment was empty. Philby was gone. He had used the confession the same way he had used everything else in his life, as a deception, a final manipulation to buy himself the hours he needed to disappear. On the night of January 23, 1963, Kim Philby boarded a Soviet freighter called the Dolmatova. By the time the British government admitted he was missing 2 months later, he was already in Moscow, being photographed for Izvestia under the headline, "Hello, Mr. Philby." The establishment's worst nightmare had come true, and there is compelling evidence they helped make it happen. Both Elliot's MI6 colleague Desmond Bristow and Philby's own Soviet handler Yuri Modin later concluded the same thing. The escape was politically engineered. The British government had let him go. Because the alternative was unthinkable: a public trial. Decades of secrets exposed. The humiliation of admitting that a man groomed to lead British intelligence had been working for the enemy since 1934. George Blake, another Soviet spy, had been caught and sentenced to 42 years. Philby, who had done far more damage over far longer, was never prosecuted. The message was clear. Some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud. And so he vanished. The ringleader, the third man, the spy who had sent Konstantin Volkov to his death in Istanbul 18 years earlier. Remember that name. Volkov. The man who walked into the British consulate offering to expose 3 Soviet moles at the highest levels of British intelligence. The man whose case was assigned to Kim Philby himself. The man who was seen being carried onto a Soviet aircraft, heavily bandaged, bound for Moscow and certain execution. Philby had protected his secret by murdering the one person who could expose it. And now he was being welcomed as a hero in the very city where Volkov had been silenced. But hero is a generous word. The Moscow that greeted Philby was not the workers' paradise he had imagined as a young idealist in Cambridge. It was grey, it was cold, it was paranoid. The KGB gave him no rank. They assigned him a minder, ostensibly for protection, but really to watch him. Even after 30 years of loyal service, they never quite trusted the Englishman who had betrayed his own country so completely. If he could betray them, why not us? Yuri Modin, the handler who had run the Cambridge network, offered a devastating assessment. He never revealed his true self. Neither the British nor the women he lived with, nor ourselves, ever managed to pierce the armor of mystery. In the end, I suspect that Philby made a mockery of everyone, particularly ourselves. The great spy spent his final decades in a Moscow apartment, drinking vodka, giving occasional interviews, and waiting for a revolution that had already eaten its children. He died in 1988. The Soviet Union he had served collapsed 3 years later. The unravelling continued without him. In 1979, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher stood before Parliament and made an announcement that sent shockwaves through the British establishment. Sir Anthony Blunt, the distinguished art historian, the surveyor of the Queen's pictures, the man who had walked the halls of Buckingham Palace for 15 years after his secret confession, was publicly exposed as the fourth man. Blunt was stripped of his knighthood. His reputation was destroyed. The deal that had protected him for a decade and a half was torn apart by a prime minister who found the cover-up more offensive than the crime. And then came John Cairncross, the fifth man, the spy who had operated at Bletchley Park, passing ultra-decrypts directly to Moscow. His identification completed the picture. 5 men, 5 Cambridge graduates, 5 traitors who had penetrated every major node of British intelligence and diplomacy during the most critical years of the 20th century. The conspiracy was finally laid bare. But exposure is not the same as understanding. The question that haunted British intelligence then, and haunts it still, is not how they did it. The question is why no one stopped them. The answer is uncomfortable. These men succeeded because they were exactly the kind of men the system was designed to trust. They had the right accents, the right schools, the right clubs, the right families. They moved through a world built on class loyalty, where a man's background was considered more reliable than any security clearance. Hugh Trevor Roper, one of the sharpest minds in wartime intelligence, looked at Philby and saw a man destined to lead MI6. He was competent. He was serious. He was professional. The very qualities that made him the perfect traitor were indistinguishable from the qualities that made him the perfect spy. A CIA officer later delivered an assessment quantifying the damage with brutal precision. The entire Western intelligence effort from 1944 to 1951 was described as minus advantage, meaning they would have achieved better outcomes by doing nothing at all. Every operation Philby touched, he inverted. This was the ultimate betrayal of class, not ideology, not money, class. These men used the privilege and trust and education given to them by their country to systematically destroy it from within. They left a permanent scar on the psyche of Western intelligence, a scar that still aches. The Cambridge Five was more than a spy ring. It was a profound institutional failure. It proved that the most dangerous enemy is not the one outside the gates, but the one who was invited in, who speaks with the right accent, and who you would never, ever suspect.